A bounty hunter could walk into any kitchen in the antebellum South and pick up a ceramic bowl from the shelf without a second thought. He was looking for paper, written passes, forged documents, hidden maps. He was looking for the evidence that a mind had been at work, that someone had been planning, that the information necessary for escape had been recorded somewhere in a form he could find and confiscate. He was looking for the things he had been trained to look for. He was not looking at the bowl in his hands. The bowl was coarse stoneware, fired brown and gray, with a rim that bore a series of small incised marks. Geometric notches, a zigzag line pressed into the clay before firing, a pattern of small X shapes arranged around the circumference. It looked to his eyes like decoration, folk craft, the kind of thing that enslaved women made in their spare hours, perhaps, or bought from a traveling peddler. It meant nothing. He set it back on the shelf and kept searching. What he had held in his hands was a map, the hypothesis of the ceramic code that enslaved and free black potters along the routes of the Underground Railroad encoded directional and safety information into the surface patterns of their work, emerged from the same body of oral tradition that produced the quilt code, and it shares with the quilt code both its essential genius and its historical controversies. The core claim is this, that certain potters, working in the stoneware tradition that had developed in the American South through the convergence of European ceramic techniques and African aesthetic sensibilities, used the surface decoration of their vessels as a vehicle for encoded information that was legible to those who had been taught to read it and invisible to those who had not. Paper burns, paper tears. Paper can be found in a search and used as evidence of exactly the kind of communication that the law was designed to prevent. A ceramic vessel, once fired, is among the most durable objects a human being can make. It survives water, fire, the passage of time, the indifferent handling of people who do not know what it contains. The map that was pressed into wet clay before firing would still be readable 100 years later. The intelligence that was encoded into a bowl's rim would travel with that bowl wherever it went, protected by the assumption that no one had thought to look there. This was the strategic logic of the ceramic code. Hide the message in the object that everyone sees and no one examines. Make the vessel so ordinary, so domestic, so obviously a bowl, that the dangerous thing it contains passes beneath the surveillance of the system designed to prevent exactly this kind of communication. The most dangerous information in the antebellum South was hidden, over and over again, in the things that the people enforcing the system had decided were beneath their notice. The surface of wet clay is a remarkably responsive medium. Before firing, it can be marked with a fingernail, a stick, a piece of wire, the edge of a comb, any tool that leaves an impression in the soft surface. The marks made before firing become permanent after it, pressed into the body of the vessel with the same durability as the vessel itself, surviving everything that the vessel survives, readable for as long as the ceramic remains intact. The potters who developed the ceramic code understood this property, and they exploited it with systematic intelligence. The specific symbols that appear in the proposed ceramic code vocabulary draw from a visual language that was itself encoded in multiple layers of meaning. The zigzag line, one of the most frequently cited elements, carried directional information. A series of zigzags indicated a route that required changes of direction, turns, the kind of non-linear travel that the drunkard's path quilt pattern also encoded. A continuous zigzag around the circumference of a vessel's rim indicated a route in active use with multiple safe stops along it. A broken zigzag, interrupted, incomplete, indicated danger, a route that had been compromised, a signal to avoid the direction it represented. The X mark was a crossroads indicator. It appeared at the point on a vessel's surface that, in the spatial logic of the code, corresponded to a junction in the route, a place where a decision had to be made, where the traveler needed additional information to choose the correct direction. The placement of the X relative to the vessel's handle, or relative to a particular decorative element that served as a reference point, indicated which direction was safe at the crossroads it represented. The notched rim, small regular indentations pressed into the lip of a vessel before firing, encoded distance information. Oral histories suggest that a single notch represented a unit of travel time, perhaps a day's walking distance to the next safe house, and that the number of notches between specific reference points on the rim could be read as a count. 3 notches meant 3 days to safety. 7 notches meant a week's journey lay ahead. These are not simple systems. They require a shared understanding of the code vocabulary, a consistent set of conventions maintained across the network of people who used them, and a training process through which new participants were taught to read the symbols accurately enough to act on them in conditions of extreme stress. The oral tradition that has preserved this system describes it as exactly that, a taught language, passed from potter to potter and from conductor to traveler, maintained through the same networks of trust and community that sustained every other aspect of the Underground Railroad's operation. The critical feature of the ceramic code, the feature that made it different from written documents and potentially superior to them in certain conditions, was its tactile nature. The marks pressed into clay before firing are readable by touch as well as by sight. A traveler moving through darkness, unable to see the vessel she held, could run her fingers around the rim and read the notches, trace the incised lines, find the X marks by feel. The map was legible in the dark. The intelligence survived the conditions under which it most needed to be used. David Drake was the most accomplished stoneware potter in the antebellum South, and he was enslaved. He worked at a pottery operation in Edgefield, South Carolina, a region that had become, by the mid-19th century, one of the most productive stoneware manufacturing districts in America, producing the large alkaline glazed storage vessels that were essential to food preservation in the era before refrigeration. Drake worked at the Miles Mill Pottery and later at other Edgefield operations, and his output included some of the largest and most technically sophisticated stoneware vessels produced in 19th century America, storage jars that held as much as 40 gallons, thrown on a wheel with a skill and physical precision that very few potters of any era have been able to replicate. He also wrote on his pots. This was, in South Carolina in the 1830s and 1840s, an act of extraordinary defiance. South Carolina had amongst the most stringent anti-literacy laws in the South, with severe penalties for enslaved people who were found to be literate and for free people who taught them to read or write. David Drake was literate. He had been taught to read, by whom the historical record does not clearly establish, and he used that literacy in the most visible possible way. He inscribed his vessels with dates, with his name, and eventually with brief poems. He signed his work. He claimed authorship of objects he had made, while being defined by the law as an object himself. The pots he made and signed are, individually, among the most remarkable objects in American material culture. Collectively, they constitute one of the most sustained acts of individual resistance in the historical record of American slavery. A man spending decades insisting, in the most durable medium available to him, that he existed, that he had made something, that his name was worth recording. Whether David Drake also encoded navigational information into his vessel's surface decoration is a question that the historical record does not definitively answer. The oral tradition suggests that Edgefield pottery was among the ceramic types used in the Underground Railroad's ceramic signaling system, and Edgefield's geographic location, on routes that connected the Deep South to the border states and the networks that led north, would have made it a logical source for coded vessels. But the specific connection between Drake's documented output and the code system remains a matter of ongoing historical investigation. What is not in question is this: David Drake was a man of extraordinary intelligence and skill, who used his craft as a form of assertion and resistance in conditions designed to prevent both. Whether or not his specific vessels carried encoded navigational information, he demonstrated that the pottery workshop could be a site of defiance, that the objects produced there could carry meanings that the system controlling their production had not authorized, and that excellence, even excellence performed under the most constraining circumstances imaginable, was a form of freedom that could not be entirely taken away. The pottery workshop in Edgefield, South Carolina in the 1840s was simultaneously two things. On its surface, it was an industrial operation, a business producing stoneware vessels for the regional market, employing enslaved labor in the skilled and physically demanding work of preparing clay, operating kick wheels, loading kilns, and managing the complex variables of a firing process that could, if mismanaged, destroy weeks of work in a single night. The workshop's owners calculated its output in vessels per week and its profit in dollars per vessel, and they managed the enslaved workers who produced that output with the standard mixture of material incentive and physical threat that characterized the management of enslaved skilled labor throughout the antebellum South. Below that surface, the workshop was something else. The potters who worked there, some enslaved, some free black workers who had purchased or been granted their freedom and who continued to work in the trade that was their livelihood, occupied a specific position in the social landscape of the antebellum South that was in some ways unusually advantageous for the purposes of covert communication. Potters traveled. The nature of their trade required them to move their products from the workshop to the market, to interact with buyers across a wide geographic area, to maintain relationships with the networks of household and farm and plantation that consumed their output. A potter delivering vessels to a farm 50 miles from the workshop was not a suspicious figure. He was doing exactly what the economic logic of his trade required him to do. He was also, if the ceramic code was in operation, delivering messages. The vessels that left the workshop carried their encoded information with them, embedded in the surface decoration that had been pressed into the clay before firing. The buyer who received them, if she was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, if she was a member of the network that maintained the quilt code and the other signaling systems of the invisible railroad, could read the information on the vessel's surface and act on it, placing the relevant piece in a window or on a shelf, where it would be visible to the travelers she was expecting, serving as a real-time status update on the route ahead. The workshop's output in this reading was not merely stoneware. It was a distributed intelligence system, with the kiln serving as the encoding station, the potter's delivery routes serving as the communication channels, and the vessels themselves serving as the messages. The system was robust. It did not depend on any single node, could not be shut down by the arrest of any single participant, and produced its cover story automatically in the form of the legitimate commercial activity that gave the potters their reason for being on the road in the first place. The regional styles that different pottery workshops developed, the specific surface treatments, the characteristic vessel forms, the distinctive decorative vocabularies that allowed knowledgeable buyers to identify a pot's origin at a glance, may have served within the ceramic code system as route identifiers. A vessel from the Edgefield district might indicate a specific set of routes and safe houses in the South Carolina interior. A vessel from a North Carolina workshop might indicate a different set of routes leading toward the Virginia border and the networks beyond it. The regional style was the equivalent of a routing code, a label that told the informed reader which part of the larger system this particular message belonged to. A woman named Grace, traveling alone, moving at night, somewhere in the Carolina interior in the winter of 1851, had been given, before she left, a single piece of information that she had committed entirely to memory. She had been told to look for a specific kind of vessel in the window of the safe house she was seeking, a stoneware jar, dark glazed with a notched rim. She had been shown what a notched rim looked like, had run her fingers over the demonstration piece, had memorized the feel of the regular small indentations pressed into the lip of the clay. She had been told that 3 notches on the near side of the handle meant she was in the right place. She had been told nothing else, because nothing else was necessary, and every piece of unnecessary information was a piece of unnecessary risk. She moved through the dark Carolina landscape with the accumulated navigational knowledge of the previous 4 nights, the star positions, the compass directions embedded in the landscape features she had been taught to read, the names of rivers she was looking for, and rivers she was supposed to avoid. She was reading the land and the sky as she had been taught to read them, and she was looking for a window with a specific object in it. She found the house after midnight. There was a vessel in the window. She could see its silhouette against the faint light inside. She approached close enough to see the rim in the weak moonlight, and she ran her fingers over it before she risked the knock at the door. The notches were there, 3 of them on the near side of the handle, exactly as she had been told. She knocked. The door opened. This scenario, reconstructed from the fragments of oral tradition that have preserved the outlines of the ceramic signaling system, illustrates the specific tactical advantage that ceramics offered over other signaling methods. A quilt could be hung and removed, but its display was visible from a distance and could be observed by surveillance. A ceramic vessel in a window was simply a ceramic vessel in a window, the most ordinary possible domestic arrangement. It required close approach to read, which meant that only someone who had reason to approach closely would receive its message. Its removal or replacement could happen without detection, and its message was readable in near darkness by touch, in exactly the conditions under which it was most likely to be needed. The oral tradition also preserves accounts of a more dynamic use of the ceramic signal, the real-time status update. A vessel with one surface presentation in the window when a conductor went to bed at night might be replaced with a different vessel, or rotated to show a different face. If conditions changed during the night, the approach of a patrol, the presence of a bounty hunter in the area, the arrival of travelers who had already taken the room, any of these contingencies could be communicated by a change in the vessel's position or presentation, a change so subtle that it would pass unnoticed by anyone who was not specifically looking for it. The firing of a ceramic vessel is a moment of transformation that the potters who worked in the antebellum South understood with an intimacy born of long practice. The kiln loaded, the fire built beneath it, the temperature rising through the hours of the night. These were the familiar rhythms of their working lives, the process by which soft clay became hard stone, by which the marks pressed into wet surfaces became permanent, by which the messages encoded in the decoration of an unfired vessel became as fixed and durable as the vessel itself. A pot that survived the kiln had survived something genuinely dangerous. The cracking, the warping, the color changes of reduction firing, the dozens of variables that could destroy an unfired vessel in the hours between loading and cooling. A pot that came out of the kiln intact was, in a meaningful sense, proof of its own resilience. The potters understood this symbolism, and the oral tradition suggests that they deployed it deliberately. A vessel made to carry encoded information was fired with particular care, loaded in a protected position within the kiln, monitored throughout the firing, pulled and inspected during the controlled cooling that followed. The message had to survive the fire to be useful, and the potters who made vessels for the network treated the firing of those vessels with a seriousness that went beyond their commercial value. The alkaline glaze that characterized much of the southern stoneware tradition, a glaze made from wood ash and local clay, fired to a temperature that produced its characteristic gray-green or brown surface, had specific properties that were relevant to the ceramic code's function. The glaze covered the surface of the vessel uniformly, including the incised marks pressed into it before firing, but it did not obscure those marks. It flowed over them, filling the depressions slightly, but left the geometric patterns legible both visually and tactilely. A glazed vessel with incised surface decoration retained the readability of its marks, while acquiring the surface that made it look, to uninformed eyes, like an ordinary piece of domestic stoneware. The kilns of the Edgefield district and the other stoneware-producing regions of the antebellum South were, if the ceramic code hypothesis is correct, encoding stations in a distributed intelligence network, places where raw information about routes and safe houses and patrol schedules was translated into the permanent, durable, undetectable medium of fired clay. The men and women who loaded those kilns and tended those fires were doing something that looked, from the outside, like skilled industrial labor and was, from the inside, the most dangerous and consequential work they had ever done. The potters who created the ceramic code system did not leave records. They could not. The act of creating a written record of the code would have been, in the legal landscape of the antebellum South, a capital offense. The knowledge they possessed, the network they maintained, the conventions they had established and were passing forward through the oral and practical tradition of their craft, all of it existed only in memory and in the physical objects they made. This is why the historical reconstruction of the ceramic code is so difficult, and why the debate about its precise extent and systematization continues among scholars who are working with fragmentary evidence and the inherent unreliability of oral traditions transmitted across generations and through the distortions of trauma and suppression. The potters were invisible cartographers, makers of maps that could not be acknowledged as maps, keepers of knowledge that could not be written down, participants in a network that could not be named. What survives is the pottery itself, and the oral tradition, and the patient work of scholars and community historians who have spent decades trying to read what the vessels contain. The ceramic collections of southern museums hold thousands of pieces of antebellum stoneware from the Edgefield district and the other producing regions associated with the Underground Railroad's routes. Most of these pieces have been cataloged primarily as examples of regional craft tradition, their aesthetic qualities noted, their provenance documented, their place in the development of Southern stoneware established. The possibility that some of them carry encoded information has been taken seriously by a growing number of researchers who have begun to analyze the surface decoration of these vessels with the specific hypothesis of the ceramic code in mind. The patterns that emerge from this analysis are suggestive. Certain decorative motifs appear consistently on vessels from specific geographic areas that correspond to known Underground Railroad routes. The same zigzag configurations, the same rim notching patterns, the same placement of X marks relative to handle position, appear on multiple vessels from the same regional tradition. These consistencies could reflect nothing more than shared aesthetic conventions within a regional craft tradition. They could also reflect something else, the consistent application of a shared code vocabulary by potters who had been taught the same system. The evidence is not conclusive. It may never be conclusive, given the nature of the sources and the systematic destruction of documentation that accompanied both slavery and its suppression of literacy. But the evidence is there, accumulating in the ceramic collections of museums that were not built to hold evidence of this kind and are only now beginning to understand what they may be holding. The choice of ceramic as a medium for encoded information was not accidental. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of materials science that the potters possessed through long practice, even if they would not have used that phrase to describe their knowledge. Fired stoneware is among the most durable materials that pre-industrial human beings could produce. It does not rot, does not rust, does not degrade in water, does not burn. A stoneware vessel buried in the ground for a century emerges essentially intact. Archaeologists regularly recover ceramic objects thousands of years old in fully legible condition. The incised decoration on a fired stoneware vessel is, in terms of physical permanence, virtually indestructible under ordinary conditions. Paper, by contrast, is fragile. It burns easily and completely. It degrades in moisture. It tears. It can be confiscated in a search and used as evidence. The people who enforced the slave system understood this, and they used it. Searching for written materials was a standard component of the surveillance apparatus, and the discovery of a written document in an enslaved person's possession could trigger severe punishment and the unraveling of entire networks. A ceramic vessel was the opposite of a written document in every relevant dimension. It was expected to be in an enslaved person's possession. It was a domestic object, a piece of kitchen equipment, unremarkable in its presence. It could not be easily destroyed. Unlike paper, it could not be quickly hidden by burning or tearing, and its message, encoded in the physical surface of the vessel itself, required no literacy to read. It was readable by touch, by a person who had been taught the code vocabulary through the practical, hands-on transmission of craft knowledge. This last point is particularly significant. The anti-literacy laws of the antebellum South were designed to prevent the transmission of information through written language, on the assumption that written language was the primary medium of complex communication. The ceramic code exploited the gap in this assumption. It transmitted complex, actionable information through a medium that was not language in any conventional sense, using a vocabulary that was not alphabetic, readable through a sense that literacy legislation had not thought to address. The system was designed, in other words, to pass through the specific mesh of the surveillance apparatus, to use the dimensions of communication that the system had not thought to monitor, precisely because they did not fit the system's model of how dangerous information traveled. It was, in the deepest sense, a security system built on a comprehensive understanding of the adversary's assumptions and a deliberate exploitation of everything those assumptions left unguarded. The archaeology of the Underground Railroad is a young field, and it is producing results that continue to complicate and enrich the historical picture. Excavations at sites associated with known Underground Railroad routes have recovered ceramic assemblages that are now being analyzed with the ceramic code hypothesis explicitly in mind. At several sites in the Ohio River Valley, the major corridor of movement from the slave states to the free states, recovered stoneware fragments show surface decoration patterns that correspond to the proposed code vocabulary with a consistency that researchers have found difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. The fragments are small, often incomplete, the product of vessels that were used and discarded over the decades of their useful life. But the patterns on their surfaces are legible, and they are telling a story. In South Carolina, ongoing work at former Edgefield pottery sites has produced both ceramic evidence and documentary evidence, business records, estate inventories, production records from the pottery operations that are being combined with the oral tradition accounts to build a more complete picture of how the Edgefield Pottery Network may have functioned as a communication infrastructure for the Underground Railroad routes in the region. The work is painstaking, the conclusions are carefully hedged, and the full picture will not be available for years. But the outline is becoming clearer. The living tradition of the ceramic code is visible in the contemporary work of African American ceramic artists who have engaged explicitly with this history. Artists working in the Edgefield tradition, some of them direct descendants of the enslaved potters who worked in the original workshops, have incorporated the proposed code vocabulary into their contemporary work, not as historical reproduction, but as active engagement with an inherited tradition. They are asking in clay the questions that the historical record cannot fully answer. What did these patterns mean? Who made them? Who read them? What was at stake? The most significant recent development has been the increasing collaboration between academic historians, archaeologists, ceramic scholars, and the African American community organizations that have preserved the oral tradition of the ceramic code across generations. The oral tradition and the archaeological evidence are beginning to speak to each other in ways that neither can achieve alone, and the dialogue between them is producing a picture of the ceramic code that is more specific, more geographically grounded, and more historically credible than either source could provide independently. The vessels that have survived from this period, the stoneware jars and bowls and jugs that sit in museum storage facilities and private collections across the American South, are being looked at with new eyes. They are being handled, examined under magnification, photographed in raking light that reveals surface details, invisible under normal illumination. They are being read carefully and systematically for the messages they may have been made to carry. There is a ceramic jar in the collection of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that was made in the Edgefield district of South Carolina sometime in the 1840s. It is a large alkaline glazed stoneware vessel, perhaps 12 inches tall, dark brown and gray from the kiln's reduction atmosphere. Its surface is marked with a series of incised lines, a zigzag that runs around the upper third of the body, a cluster of X marks near the base, a notched rim with 7 indentations pressed at regular intervals around the lip. The museum's catalog describes it as a storage jar, typical of Edgefield production, with characteristic surface decoration. This is accurate. It is also possibly incomplete. The jar sits in its case, patient and permanent, and it does not explain itself. It cannot. The person who made it, who pressed those marks into the wet clay before firing and who knew what those marks meant, has been dead for a century and a half. The people who read those marks and acted on the information they contained have been dead almost as long. The network of knowledge that gave the marks their meaning, the shared code vocabulary, the training that taught people to read it, the trust that made the whole system possible. That network dissolved over the decades after the Civil War, when the urgency that had called it into being was replaced by different urgencies, different struggles, different forms of resistance, what remains is the jar. The marks in its surface are permanent. They will outlast everything else. This is the final lesson of the ceramic code, and it is one that goes beyond the specific historical circumstances of the Underground Railroad. The potters who encoded information into wet clay before firing were not only solving an immediate tactical problem, how to transmit dangerous information in a surveilled landscape. They were also, perhaps without fully intending it, creating a form of permanence that paper and memory and oral tradition cannot match. They were building into the most durable medium available to them a record that could not be burned, could not be confiscated, could not be denied. The record is still there. The marks are still readable. The vessels are still in the collections, in the farmhouses, in the archaeological strata of the sites where the freedom seekers traveled and the conductors worked and the potters fired their kilns through the long nights of the antebellum South. We are only beginning to understand how to read them. In 2026, as the descendants of the enslaved potters of Edgefield continue their work in clay, as the archaeologists continue their excavations, as the oral tradition continues to be documented and analyzed and compared with the physical evidence, the conversation between the living and the dead is ongoing. The potter's mark, pressed into wet clay by hands that have been still for 150 years, is still speaking. We are learning, slowly and carefully, and with the humility that the subject demands, to listen. The most powerful messages, it turns out, are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are pressed quietly into soft clay, fired hard in the night, and left in a window where the right eyes, the right hands, the right knowledge will find them. Sometimes the revolution fits in the palm of your hand. Sometimes the map to freedom is a bowl.